First one is about the Hall of Fame. Most of our Hall of Fame things are at the other building, as you know, but we're going to have a book coming out pretty soon with all of our 102 Hall of Fame people in it. The chairman of our Hall of Fame is Jack Willie. He's back here now. And we're asking everybody before the 30th of March, we hope to have people submit nominations for people that they want to submit to be a member of the Hall of Fame. So if you have someone in your family, someone you know, that you think belongs in our Hall of Fame, just please let us know. There's some forms you can fill out, or you can just do it yourself, or give Jack Willie a call. Because, you know, as we go back over the 102 members that we have in our Hall of Fame, they're all wonderful people, did great things for Jackson County. But then you think of all the people that also did things for Jackson County that are not in the Hall of Fame yet, and we have a lot of people that we should be nominating. So just kind of give that a thought. We kind of do that the first 3 months of the year, and then the committee gets together and decides who's going to be nominated for that year. Did I say there's a new book coming out about that? Hall of Fame book. Okay. So hopefully by the end of March, we'll have that book available. Want to tell you about next week's Brown Bag Lunch. Please don't miss it. It should be wonderful. It's Tony Borwald, who's the naturalist at the Hurstville Interpretive Center. Tony is a fascinating guy, does a wonderful job. He's going to be talking to us about one of his passions, which is the remnant prairies in Jackson County. He tells us that those are prairie areas that have just never been disturbed or never been developed, so that the native plants and things are growing there. I know on his prairie east of town, he has a real rocky area, and he has cone flowers growing there. Dr. Hamilton has cone flowers growing there, and he is positive that those were seeds deposited during the last glacier that came through. So it's just fascinating things to be studied with that. He said it gives us glimpses into Iowa's natural history, as well as hosting diverse plant species, quality of life habitat, and it's very interesting to nature lovers. So I know we're all nature lovers, so that should be a really good program. I also want to thank the two Mayberries who did such wonderful brown bag lunches for us last time, the last two brown bag lunches. Sue Mayberry's appliance thing I'm kind of taking off of today, but I notified Dr. Mark Depew, who gave our brown bag lunch when we first started up again, about the Sizer family, George Sizer and his Civil War records. Apologized that I didn't, and he's related to the Sizer who Barbara's program is about, Merle Sizer. And so I let him know that that program is now online, and you can watch it online, though I apologize because Barbara's kind of in the dark. But you can still see her awesome program. And so he got back to me, told me that he would be watching Barbara's program that evening with his wife, and that he too had gone online and looked for a copy of the book, Marry Me, and the one that he found online was $147. So he had not bought it. But anyway, he wanted to be remembered to all of you and said he'd be back to visit us soon. Okay, so I'm going to turn the lights off. We have problems. You sure? Thank you. So as you know, we have problems with our lighting, but we're working on it with the help of Mary, and we're trying to get it so you can see the photos that we're showing you. I'm going to change this one for a second, as well as see who's talking. Okay, so kind of because of Sue's program about early refrigerators and things like that, ice boxes and whatever, it was also very interesting. I started thinking about back in the day, and of course this is the time of the year when a very important industry took place in our whole country really, but certainly here in Jackson County. And so we're calling this ice harvesting back in the day, because this is the time of year that this all happened. So the streams and rivers of Jackson County, as you know, are among our more wonderful natural resources. We're so blessed in Jackson County to have so many so many natural resources. And I was always surprised when I first came back when they talked about harvesting the Mississippi. I thought, harvesting the Mississippi, that didn't make sense to me. But when you stop and think about it, all of the ducks and geese and waterfowl that are taken every year from the Mississippi, the fish, of course, the mussels, and something I hadn't thought of, again, was the natural ice that comes from our streams and rivers. And so that natural ice harvesting, became one of the major industries of our whole country. And again, I don't think we think of it that way. Goes back to practically the beginning of time, I guess. Primitive people used caves to keep their meat from spoiling. The Greeks and the Romans used snow-filled pits. Their main thing was they lined it with grass and straw because they had to keep their wine cool. We know that Nero, before he was fiddling, used slaves to bring harvested snow down from the mountains so that he would have ice year-round. And in America, the earliest reference to snow harvesting in ice and saving it in pits and caves was in Virginia in about 1865. I was fortunate enough to live on land that had once belonged to George Washington by Mount Vernon. And so I got to see it. Maybe many of you have visited Mount Vernon as well and gone through his property. He has a very interesting ice house on his property which you can visit. Have you seen that?
Yes, I have.
All right. Another one, and I actually, in Charlottesville, Virginia, I actually lived next to that one also, was at Monticello, or Monticello, however you say it, Thomas Jefferson's home. And Thomas Jefferson had an ice house at his estate, and it was 16 feet deep, and it held 62 wagon loads of ice. So he had ice year-round from his venture. But it wasn't until the 1830s that harvested ice was used commonly for ordinary people for their food preservation. Only the really wealthy had it to begin with. But then American pioneers, our pioneers, began to cut ice from the rivers and the streams and the ponds, and we have a lot of those here. And then as communities grew, areas like ours had to furnish ice for the more populous cities like Chicago and places like that. And so it grew into a huge, massive industry. And I was again surprised to learn that back in the day, the second leading export from our country, the United States of America, was ice. We exported ice, and the only thing back then that we exported in greater amounts was cotton. So back in the day, this was quite the thing. So the slide that you see here, I've kind of borrowed some of these things from other historical societies around. The picture that you see here is, of course, harvesting ice in Iowa. And the last 2 weeks of January and the first 2 weeks of February are known to be the coldest weeks of the year, almost without exception. So that's the time that this great ice harvest took place. It started out, at least in our part of the country, as kind of a communal thing. It was a social event. It was like a barn raising, or it was like threshing day or corn husking bee. And because the ice had to be harvested when it was ready, meaning the temperature was right and the ice was thick enough, you had to have large crews that were available quickly when the ice was the proper thickness. Because remember, the ice, even though you were cutting it, it had to hold the weight of maybe several horses, sleds, the men working on it. So you could cut the ice, but you had to be very careful or everything would end up in the brink. And if they were ready to cut the ice and the weather turned mild, they would work all night, hundreds of men, by lanterns, cutting the ice to get the ice out of the river before it got too soft. I want to go back to that first picture. I borrowed this from the DeWitt Historical Society, so I want to give them full credit, but they had a wonderful newsletter, and they had this picture on the front about saving the starving people of the world. And they said, winter task for farmers, winter occupation for icemen, and that's what it was. But if you look down below and you think about it, it really was the first agricultural product that was harvested. harvested in January. How many harvests take place in January? So I just thought that was really cool. Okay. Again, ice harvesting around Iowa. This is how it looked practically everywhere you went. People got together, people all pitched in, and people put up ice for the summer. Now, a lot of the figures and things I have came from the Clinton County Historical Society. They've done a lot of research and they have a lot of things at their museum. So according to them, ice was ready to harvest when it was 14 inches thick. And you'll see it written anywhere from 20 inches to even 28 inches, depending on who's doing it and what it is. But at least 14 inches thick was what the Clinton County people and the people around here went by. So if the temperature was above 20 degrees, then the ice was too wet to handle. It had to be below 20 degrees. If the temperature was below 0, they couldn't do it either, because then the ice became too brittle, and they weren't. So there was a small window of time. The ice had to be thick enough, and the temperature had to be just right before they could commence. Then they would clear the area with snow so that they could get to the ice. And they had to be careful how they did that as well. They didn't want to clear too much at one time because the snow acted as an insulator to keep the ice from freezing too deeply. They didn't want 6 foot of ice because then they couldn't get their blocks out. It had to be the right thickness. So in the beginning, our little farmers around here and our carpenters and our people that went out to harvest, they used simple tools. They used what they had. They had axes and saws and scrapers that were made by the local blacksmiths, because you know how important those blacksmiths were to everything. It wasn't until much later on that the specialized tools that you'll see here were developed as they began to prepare to cut these blocks. So the tools were made by the blacksmith at first. Later on, tools were purchased from large Eastern manufacturing firms. And think of the horses. They had horses on the ice, slipping on the ice. So they equipped the horses sometimes with caulked shoes so that they wouldn't slip. Sometimes they put shoes on the horses that had spikes to help them from slipping. Men who were lucky enough to have special boots to work on the ice wore expensive, thick-soled boots with spikes to do this. This was mostly people who did it for a living. Those cost $20 a pair back in the day when these icemen were paid $3.50 a day. And this was a long, long day. So they used what they could. They did the best they could. And there's some of the early tools that they used. I went out to the machine shed. We have a wonderful ice making display, ice harvesting display in the machine shed behind us. And it'd be nice if some of you were interested if you stopped out and looked at that before you left today. So I went out to bring some of those things in. And of course, they're all screwed down, wired down, so they don't just walk away one day. And so I couldn't find anything to bring in but a scale, which I'll show you later. Everything else is well secured, so we know Phil Gent is doing a good job. So, but the sled that you see here was used. It was pulled after they took the snow from the ice. It was pulled by a horse across the ice. A man sat on the seat, driving the horse, and his weight added as ballast, so that he cut grooves into the ice. And they had to be very careful. Like I said, they didn't want to go any more than 2/3 of the way through the ice, or it would be too deeply, and the men and the horses and everybody else would end up in the water. But this is kind of what most people around here used. All right. So this is actually a Maquoketa picture, and we believe that's Ed Kirchhoff. But the work proceeded, like we said, first they cleared the snow, then they very carefully made 2 right-angled baselines to guide the saw. The first cuts were laid out so that they could measure from that, so that they could ensure that all these cakes of ice were perfectly the same size. Sometimes they were square, sometimes they were a little bit rectangular, but they had to be the same size. That was very important when they came to storing the ice. And so then they made the 2 baselines, then the men marked the grid, and the horses pulled either a rake or a cart like this to mark the grooves in the ice. Then they brought in the teams of men, and these teams of men worked in a long line. They had single-handled cross-cut ice saws, and they cut the blocks first in parallel lengths, long lengths. Then they went back and they scored it crosswise, and then they broke it into cakes and used poles and hooks to get it to shore. Either they floated it to shore, or they hooked it up to horses and put ropes around it, hooked up to horses to be pulled into the shore and taken out of the water. So once done, the large blocks were taken by wagon or sled to the ice house, where they were loaded onto, if they were fortunate, a conveyor belt that had been set up to move them into the building. And they had to pack it very, very carefully if this ice was going to last until the next ice harvest, which was a whole year, really. So on the Mississippi, at least, and in our area, blocks were either 22 by 32 inches, which is the rectangle, or they cut them 44 inches square. And, excuse me. Like I say, the commercial ones that were cut on the Mississippi were all cut in 300-pound blocks. Those were sold to businesses. A lot of them were exported. But think about this, most of them went to the railroads. And they went to the railroads to cool what was called a refrigeration car, so that produce, meats, and dairy products and things could be shipped safely across the country to their markets. So if you look carefully right here, you can see the way they have the grids marked. And this is what they would cut. They would either finish sawing them through with an ice saw, or if they were lucky, they had chisel kind of tools that they could put down in and just pull them back hard, and they could pop them loose, and the ice would make a clean break. Okay, so this is an ice house that I think was on North 5th Street. It was behind what was then Harry Billups' house. I grew up on North 5th Street, and I think I kind of know where that was. So an ice house was kind of anything that was a big empty building that they could stash the whole way across and layer their ice all the way to the top. It needed really good ventilation, and it needed a drainage system, because no matter how careful they were, when it got to be 110 and humid in Iowa, there was going to be some melting, and they had to be able to drain that melted water away, or everything would just be ruined. So as you see here, here's a Hamley ice wagon. This is Hamley. We think of Hamley the photographer, but his family that was here before him. We know that we don't know a lot about their business. We know that they had their ice wagons, and they went door to door selling ice. We don't know if they had their own operation, their own ice house. We'd like to find out more about that. So whether this was actually their ice house, it was the common ice house, and they would buy ice from that ice house to run their routes. But there were many of those routes. So as early as 1803 in the Midwest, because remember we're on the west side of the river, but on the east side of the river, they were settled and doing things by them. Farm journals began publishing articles for farmers, giving advice on how they could construct ice houses. And they could be built, they said, of brick or stone or wood. Some were underground, some were above, some were a combination of both. In an 1855 article, it stated that farmers considered the ice house to be as necessary on their property as the woodshed or the barn, because they had to have ice. Especially dairy farmers, of course, who, and almost everybody had dairy cows of some sort back then, whether it was for their own need or whether they took their milk and their cream to market. So they had to have some way to keep their milk cool before they delivered it to the creamery. If they couldn't afford to build a separate structure, Farmers sometimes used a portion of their barn. They put it in the cellars of their house, which makes me think they had a very cold house for the winter. They were up above. Or they used their wells, and they put the ice in the wells to keep it cold. But it was a critical thing to farmers. So we talked about the ice house and the proper filling of the ice house and how critical it was. It had to be very detailed, very precisely packed away, or the whole thing didn't work. It was important that it was done with exactness because it had to last a whole year. So the first row was stacked within a foot of the walls, and the walls were lined with, it says double straw-filled walls. I don't know whether that means 2 bales of straw. Not sure what that means, but that's what it said and everything. And then they would file the blocks of ice. They were meticulously shaved so that with a finely whetted axe so that they fit snugly to each other. To prevent sticking, the ice was turned so that the wet bottoms rested on the sawdust so they didn't all stick together. And then fresh snow was packed between the blocks. After they got the whole building filled with the first layer, they put about 2 inches of sawdust across it all. Now this sawdust, think of the sawdust. The sawdust came from the local lumber mills, but it had to be cured, it had to be dried. And so during the summer, this sawdust all had to be dried so that it would be, and kept dry, so that it would be ready to use when the ice harvest begins. So that's kind of another phase of this whole thing. So the sawdust was shoveled onto the ice cakes, and then the second layer was put in, and the third layer, etc., all the way to the very top if they could. And like we said, ventilation and drainage was crucial. Sawdust proved to be an excellent insulator. It was the best thing they could have ever found. They used straw, they used other things, but sawdust turned out to be the very best thing. And it kept the ice from melting all the way through the hot summers, through the fall, and really into the winter in many cases. It's one of my favorite pictures. These photographs came, we all think, when we think of ice around here, we think of Kirchhoff's, right? And Kirchhoff and his ice business, which we're going to talk about. But this is one of his ice trucks. Isn't that neat? Can anybody tell me where that's parked? Oh, I already told you, didn't I? Sorry about that. Okay, I gave you a hint. All right. Like I say, there were many of these routes run by different people, starting their own little businesses, doing their own little things. Also, ice was sold. They would put sheds by the grocery stores. All of our little mom and pop grocery stores, a lot of them at least, would have a shed that was built by them to hold their ice. House-to-house routes were available all year round. So when we talk about this ice industry, it didn't just happen in January. People needed ice all year round. And so all year round, there were deliveries. Of course, in the summertime, there had to be more deliveries and more deliveries because the ice didn't last as long. Does anybody remember the signs? Well, remember hearing about maybe the signs that they put in the windows. I wish that we had, the museum had a sign from a local ice company. We don't seem to. I'll show you a picture in a minute of one of the ones that they used. But it was, signs have 4 sides. And so it was 25 pounds, 50 pounds, 75 pounds, 100 pounds. You'd put the sign in your window early in the morning, how many pounds you wanted up, so the iceman would know exactly how much ice you were getting. And Sue talked about the house. Which house were you talking about? The house? The Carson house. The Carson house. That had, and a lot of the nicer houses, the newer houses at least, they had a place for their ice with an outdoor, with a door to the outside. Iceman would carry the ice up, put it right in, and then you would access it from the inside. So that was really a nice feature to have back in that day, I'm sure. Okay, so there's a card. It's not a card from Jackson County, but that's what an ice card would look like. What other things do you remember people putting cards in the window for? If you wanted somebody to stop. Milk. Do you remember doing that?
I remember reading about it.
Reading about it, right? Yeah. And the other thing, may I tell you, was the bakery truck, if you wanted the bakery truck. So Morning Glory Bakery ran routes through Maquoketa, through Bellevue, through Lost Nation. They went to all the little towns and ran their early morning bakery routes. Maybe I don't say that word right. And if you wanted them to stop, you put the card in the window, just like the ice card or the milk card, and they would stop and you could buy bread, pies, whatever you were interested in for the day. So these ice cards were really, really important. So one artifact that I found that I could bring to show you was an ice scale. I mean, it's a scale, but it's 1 to 300 pounds, and that's what the biggest block of ice weighed 300 pounds. Don't ask me exactly how they attached it, but on the back at every ice house, there was an ice scale like this. Yeah. Every ice truck that made its rounds through the cities had one of these on the back of the truck. And the neat thing about the Iceman was that if he was experienced, and if he was good and he knew his business, he could look at your card, see that you wanted 50 pounds of ice, take out his chisel, chop off 50 pounds of ice, didn't have to weigh it. Take it up and put it in your house, and almost always it would be within 1 pound to 2 pounds. He just knew how much each thing weighed, and I thought that was really neat. The Iceman was also the most popular guy in town when the temperatures soared around here, because the kids would always follow the ice wagon. Because as he chipped away, all those little chips of ice would be flying everywhere, and of course the kids would want the ice. Now, were you supposed to use this ice that came from the river for drinking water? No. But did most people? Yes, because that's what they had. So I always wonder if maybe every now and then there wasn't a frog in there or it was something. I don't know how that worked. Did you ever find weeds in your ice or whatever? I guess maybe it all settled as the ice froze and you got just plain ice. I don't know. But anyway, that was just really quite a deal. The ice trucks did their routes all year round because people needed ice all year round. So Sue talked about how the ice box and how the ice box, when the ice box was invented, and many of the residential ice boxes were homemade. People made them out of oak or pine or ash. They lined them with zinc or slate or porcelain, or if you didn't have lots of money, maybe galvanized tin or even wood. You put an insulator between the walls. You could use charcoal or cork or straw or flax or mineral wool, all kinds of things to give it as much insulation as you could. And still, with all that, you were lucky if your light ice lasted 2 days. You had to do this every couple of days. So as in your ice box, as the ice melted, it was caught in the pan, went down into a drip pan that you would hope evaporated, but I'm sure a lot of times that had to be emptied before it overflowed. So it was quite an ordeal to run a kitchen back in that day. But it was certainly a lot better to refrigerate all the food that you could, other than have it spoil when food was so scarce, money was so scarce, you didn't waste anything if you could help it, or eating tainted food and maybe getting sick. So ice was just critical. Well, in 1870, they began to experiment with artificial ice. And Sue may have talked a little bit about this too. In the winter of 1890, for instance, it was so warm that the supply of natural ice was insufficient to meet the demand. It was such a warm winter, they couldn't fill the ice houses. And so by the time summer came, there was no ice. And people were really, really in trouble. So all of the inventive people, seeing the need and needing to make a buck, began to find ways to make ice, to make artificial ice. And they experimented by expanding, condensing, and expanding again gases and liquids through tubes. And soon they were able to manufacture ice as a supplement to natural ice. But that was all very dangerous. A lot of times it didn't work very well. There were a lot of accidents and that sort of thing. So it took a long time to develop this. So from the other historical society, we read that in Illinois, they were always a little bit ahead of us in some things. There were 8 artificial ice plants in Illinois by 1889. And by 1829, and there were 29 by 1899. So in 10 years, they gained a little bit. In 1909, a man by the name of E.T. Allen selected Clinton to be the site for his first huge artificial ice plant west of the Mississippi River. They were a huge company. They also sold coal, and they became one of the largest fuel dealers in the city. By 1912, there were 7 ice companies in the city of Clinton itself. The new ice caught on, and like the river ice, was sold mostly by local ice dealers until the mid-30s. The commercial ice was a little bit smaller, but it was still a very important industry because, as you can imagine, a lot of people needed that. Commercial fishermen, they had to have ice in order to get protect their fish and get them to their markets. The duck hunters, the breweries, they had to have ice, didn't they? So, and of course the dairies. So ice was still very, very important. And again, as we said, the ice that was harvested was delivered, a lot of it, to the railroads, so that they could get their perishables to the masses of people in Chicago and places like that. They would have to stop along the way and add more ice, because if it was a horrible hot Midwestern day, you can imagine how quickly that ice would melt. So they would have to stop and keep adding ice and adding ice. So it was just, something we don't even think about, a struggle that we don't have to deal with today, that we don't even think about. And of course, like all change, not everybody was happy with this change to natural ice, especially people who made their living cutting and selling ice, because there were a lot of men that worked those 3 or 4 weeks in the winter, made what was then a great deal of money, and that was going to be missing to them. But the harvesting of ice continued well into World War II, and not many people having electric refrigerators until maybe the 40s, do we say, Sue? 40s, do you think?
Yeah, I would say 40s, 50s.
Okay. And then by the 50s or beyond, harvesting ice was kind of a thing of the past. I mean, you could still go buy your bag of ice at the store like you do now, but actual harvesting of ice didn't happen anymore. We know that each town had at least one ice company. Even a town small like Maquoketa, they had more than one. We know that there was one in Bellevue and one in Andrew, but we certainly need more information about these. So if that happened to be a family member of yours, or you know anything about it, we would really like to know. This is just, as I was guessing where one might be in Bellevue. This is a pond that was in Bellevue. It's where Raider Brothers is now. And it's from a Bellevue postcard. But you see all those kids skating. It would be, I think, a likely spot for ice harvesting there. And one of the things that made me think that is, yeah, the brewery. And again, I gave you a hint, huh? The brewery over here. So the ice houses were always located where the ice was needed, not where they harvested the ice. They harvested the ice, they moved it. Because you harvested it once, but you needed it all year round. So the ice house was where the demand was. When we think of ice fishing on the Mississippi, this is Judy Putnam. And there was a wonderful brown bag lunch years ago, and a great display. We have all of his ice fishing things, his fishing nets and things are on display in the machine shed. Here are the ice harvesting thing if you care to go look. But he was just just quite a character. He was a man who spent his whole life on the river, wrote a book that we talked about here quite a bit called Tugging and Yanking, I think, on the fishnets, if you remember that. His daughter is Peggy Hayes, who is she's a hairdresser, I believe, in Bellevue, is his daughter, and she saw to it that those things came to us. But when you read the statistics, which are just amazing, of how much was harvested from the Mississippi River, the ducks, the fish, the mussels, and certainly the ice, and taken to markets, it's just really astounding. And of course, Bellevue shipped by rail, they shipped by boat. There was a lot of need there. So I'm just saying, there had to be places. We know that there was an ice company in Andrew. Does anybody know where that might have been? What a family name might have been? We can't find any information about that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the one we do know about, the one in Maquoketa, which was Ed Kirchhoff's. And we need to talk about Ed Kirchhoff every now and then because he is a member of our Hall of Fame. Most of the information that I have about Ed came from his good friend Jerry Rasmussen in the book The Maquoketa I Remember. Ed was born in 1892, just to give you some context, and by 1915, when he was 23, he had purchased half interest in the Bowman Ice Company in Maquoketa. We don't know about the Bowman Ice Company in Maquoketa, so we're searching for information here. Ed, as a young kid, had been interested in the business because he was one of the ones that went out and volunteered, that worked with the ice crews at Pinhook, which later became Lakehurst, and that's where the majority of our ice came from. Ed was an enterprising young man, as he was an enterprising older man, and within 6 months he bought out the entire business. When he went away to serve for 2 years during the war in the Army Corps of Engineers, during World War I, the company was run by his brother Bill, and so the company went on. But I would like to show you, okay, this is Kirchhoff's Ice House at Pinhook, and you can see the sign on the side of the building. Now this information is from Keith Francis. According to Keith Francis, Kirchhoff cut his ice at Pinhook, or later called Lakehurst. This ice house is close to 100-foot square and 50-foot tall. And again, Keith Francis described in detail the process of getting the ice into the ice house and the 2 inches of ice that went between the layers, and how the sawdust was obtained, like we said, from local sawmills, and how it had to be carefully cured and dried during the summer. And he says that Kirchhoff used this ice house until the dam went out, and then he no longer cut ice on the river. But then he either brought it in from Dubuque, or he made it artificially in town. So then we see this building. And I went by there yesterday to look. It used to be Kirchhoff's locker, I think, at one time when I was a little girl. Now it's, I think, Bill's parking lot. But, so Kirchhoff built this building. And there was an Excelsior Record newspaper article, March 15th, 1921. And in that article, Kirchhoff was announcing that they would be building a new artificial ice plant at 108 South Madison. They purchased the lot, and I thought this was interesting. They purchased the lot that the old canning factory stood on. And they cleared the ground, and they were expected to have their new operation up and running in 60 days. We don't know if that happened in 60 days, but that's what they thought. It's interesting because you see this property, he also drilled a very deep well next to it. That was to supply fresh, clean water to his ice that he was making. And then he, being a very good businessman, was well aware that the railroad ran right across the other side of the street. And he would have easily put a spur across. If he chose to continue making artificial ice, he would have an easy way to ship it out to wherever he was selling it. So he was a man, I'm sure, who was always thinking, and that's why he was so very successful. that is his, now you see at that time, it just says Makokata Ice Company, right? Okay, so here's a picture. In 1927, the picture's dated, a little bit later, and now it's the Makokata Ice Company and Ice Cream Company. Makokata Ice and Ice Cream Company. So having fresh, clean ice inspired Ed to go into the ice cream business. Ice wasn't as in demand as it had been. He could see that it was coming toward the end of an era. And so he started making ice cream. And if you remember, Kirchhoff ice cream was extremely good, very, very successful. And he sold ice cream all over the Midwest, maybe further, I don't know. But it was called at that time Kirchhoff Ice and Ice Cream Company. But it had ice cream had a slack season back then. I don't think it does now. I think it's popular all year round. But it had a slack season, and during that slack season, Ed went into the dairy processing business as well. And he was making wholesale and home deliveries of milk and cream and butter, and I'll show you this ad. But those are his trucks that he run his routes with. So there's his ad.
Bonnie,
Yes.
my dad worked for Ed Kirchhoff.
Really?
The ice cream and made ice cream. And I know as kids growing up, he would bring ice cream home. He wouldn't ever eat it because he tasted so much of it as they were making it. I could tell till the day he died, he didn't eat ice cream. And Mom and Dad lived in the little house right beside that. And my brother and sister, Rose and Jerry, were born and lived in that house. And then they moved to where they later lived on Otto Street 2 months after I was born because the house was too small for 3 kids.
Oh, that is so neat. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you remember what he called his ice cream?
I got it.
Was it Kirchhoff's? Somehow in my head I have marigold or something.
In 1954 or 55,
Okay,
Joe Rollinger, Lowell Bollinger,
okay.
pulled into my folks' driveway, walked in the house, and threw about 5 gallons of ice cream at my mother and said, "We're having a party here tonight."
Oh, wow. Awesome. Well, it must have been very, very good ice cream.
It was good.
He just was a very successful man, as you can see. Well, by 1911, hope I have these numbers right, Sue. Okay.
One time our freezer quit working at home. I was probably 5 years old, and I remember we could eat all the ice cream we wanted because they had no place to do it.
They got to get eaten up, huh? Did you eat till you were sick? Probably.
I think we had a lot of ice cream in the freezer. Yeah, this would have been in 1963, maybe.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, we talked about that he had the Kirchhoff locker. He raised beef, and this is just off the top of my head, but he raised fox and mink, and they ate the byproducts of the beef and whatever. And so he had lots and lots of ventures and lots of things going on. Well, I think that by 1911, General Electric made the first mechanical icebox, and you see different dates depending on what. I might not agree exactly with what. Please, Sue. She probably had the better information. By about the 1930s, the first electric icebox was made because they discovered Freon. Before that time, gases had been experimented with, but they were inconvenient. Sometimes they were deadly. So, seeing the writing on the wall, when Prohibition was repealed, Kirchhoff was looking for other things to do. And so, the Kirchhoff firm became one of the very first licensed beer distributors in Iowa. So that's how he got through raising foxes and mink and everything else to being a distributor. The ice business gave way to mechanical refrigeration. That part of the business discontinued, leaving the firm named Kirchhoff Ice Cream Company. Then in the late 40s, the dairy portion of the business was sold to a Quad City firm. And in 1960, the ice cream business was sold to Beatrice Food Corporation. And I don't know why I think metal gold, I don't know where that came from in my head. Since that time, the firm's name has been Kirchhoff Distributing Company. The distribution of beer has been their business, and of course they are headquartered out of Dubuque, Iowa now. But again, a very, very successful firm. So, a lot of the information that we have came from other museums around. Our old friend Jerry Rasmussen and Keith Francis. And I'd like to know what memories you have of any of this. Does anybody have any, other than eating ice cream until they were sick? Do you remember? Roger.
I remember distinctly as a little boy being at Tabor's, and they had a good sized ice house.
Oh.
I remember the sawdust in it. It was quite etched in my memory.
So this was on their farm, your grandparents' farm?
Yeah, for the winery, yes.
Okay. And that's completely gone now, I assume.
We had when I was growing up, my dad showed us a picture of one of the ice houses that they had when they grew up, and that scale that you have, there was they had a huge chunk of ice, a scale with a huge ice pick around it.
Yes.
And that, I mean, it was just huge, and because they had, my dad was real little, he's probably like 4 or something, standing next to this big block of ice.
Big block of ice.
Yeah.
And you just think of those icemen that we talked about that made these routes around Maquoketa every day of the week. They were out doing that, carrying maybe 100-pound blocks of ice on their back up to somebody's house, into their house, if they didn't have an outdoor thing, into their house and putting it in their ice box. Man, that was...
My my mom and dad, well, my grandparents had a dairy farm, and they had to have chunks of ice to keep the cream, the milk cold.
Sure.
So it was just, it was a big production. It was just tons of ice they went through all the time.
Wow.
So, I wish we had more pictures of it. I'll
I
have
do
to see if I can find them, but.
Oh, that would be what, if any of you come across old photographs or anything of any of this, we'd be so grateful if we could just copy them, because we don't have as much as we wish, even in Maquoketa.
One thing, when we first started in the business, and we had our sales rep that had called on us, and I just will never forget how they explained refrigeration, and maybe all of you know this, I don't know, but it doesn't make cold. It's the absence of heat in refrigeration.
Takes away the heat.
It takes away the heat.
I read that.
Always impressed upon me, and I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Any thoughts, ideas? Velda?
I have a question. I grew up on a farm that had an ice house, and I thought it had, like I said, I don't have any pictures.
Uh-huh.
I thought it had a partition, and I know you saw this. That was in the north part, but I thought there was beyond that brick wall, stone wall, a smaller portion to the south part of that building. So I wondered if maybe they kept meat there. Would there be enough?
Sure.
I mean, I'm searching. I don't know.
Sure.
I only have questions.
Sure. Well, it would be like a fruit cellar that you had, back in the day. And it would only make sense to have your fruit cellar by your ice storage place.
I don't know if I can come up with the right conclusion
Well,
or something.
for years, Nims's had a locker there, where they sold meat, and you could rent a locker and put your quarter of beef in
So
there.
where Kirchhoff's
It was
was?
right apart of Kirchhoff's building.
Okay.
It was on the south end. You could go in there, you could buy your fresh ground beef, and you could
Oh, really?
store, and you could probably talk to Bubby Nims and get some history
Oh,
on
I'm gonna do
that.
that.
Because he was a part of that.
Okay. But it's just how quickly we forget, not that we ever knew, but how quickly we forget the lengths that people had to go to just to have safe food to eat. And no wonder they had to go to the store every day, because they didn't have any way to keep their, safe way to keep their food. And so we live in a very blessed time in some ways. In some ways, they did. I know how that is. All right. Thank you so much. If anybody would like to go out and look at the ice harvesting display, or if you, I'd be happy to take you out. If you'd rather wait for a warmer day, we can do that too. It's cold out there. But thank you so much. Please don't forget, wonderful brown bag lunch with Tony from the Hurstville Interview Center about prairies and native prairies. Thank you very much.